Dawn tied the rope for her, then the deadliest rider arrived and called her his bride. The morning stood bright and open, and the boards of Mesa Crossing Square held the weight of 100 boots, while the rope on the gallows traced a shallow oval against a clean blue sky. The air carried coffee smoke and horse sweat, and the flint scratch of someone nervous with a match, and the sun came down fair and honest, so that nothing hid, and every face showed what it believed about justice. The platform rose from rough pine beams and iron spikes hammered by a blacksmith who could not meet his own reflection. This day, and on that platform waited Elara Wren, barefoot in a wheat-colored dress that had once held the scent of lye soap and garden wind. Her wrists crossed with coarse hemp, her hair braided to keep its order. Though the world had lost its own, she kept her chin still as the marshal read the words again. That paper breath steady as if the sound of it could make guilt real, and yet the names inside the paper shifted like minnows in water and would not be held, and the crowd murmured their judgments low, because low is how poison moves through a town, and all of it under a sun that washed the wood in pale gold and set the iron nails to glinting. The preacher stood with a book so damp the pages curled like leaves after rain. The judge watched with a thin mouth and eyes that weighed reputation more than truth, and near the scaffold stood a wagon with a broken wheel and a stack of crates, because in these places death borrows the same tools as freight and no one thinks it strange. The sound that turned the morning came first as a far shiver in dust, then picked up shape and power and came on strong until a dark bay slid into the square, with light under each hoof, like the ground had learned to carry mercy for once. And the man astride wore a canvas duster, rubbed pale along the seams, and a hat brim low. His jaw quiet and set. His name traveled ahead of him the way heat goes before fire, and when he raised the revolver, it pointed not at any heart, but at the wide sky, so that the thunder of the shot would touch everyone the same. And he said, "Hold," and the rope ceased its slow pendulum, and even the hens behind the mercantile forgot their fuss. And he said words that threw the square into a hush, shaped like awe. "Get your hands off my wife," and the judge opened his mouth and found no sound at first, as if the sun had burned it out, and the Marshal Blake Thorne set his boots and said, "The sentence stands, and the time is now," and the man on the bay replied, "Time is mine to answer for," and he swung down, and walked not fast, because men who hurry make poor promises. And he climbed the steps and laid the pistol on the boards, so the light could sit on it, and all could see. He meant his next act with both hands empty. He took the knots at Elara's wrists, and worked them with a care not often seen in public, and the rope fell away gentle as something tired of pretending to be strong, and he said, "By word and will and witness, Elara Wren, I make you my wife here in the bright of day." And the preacher looked at the town and then at the sky and said he would stand for witness, because sometimes a man must place his fear on the same altar as his faith. And the judge sputtered about ink and license, and the marshal's eyes met Elara's by accident, and did not leave as quickly as the law would have liked, and the vows were plain as bread and water, spoken clean and without grandness. And when they were done, a ring did not appear, only a narrow strip cut from a saddle string, bound once around her finger, snug as the moment itself, and it seemed the earth waited to see what the next breath would bring. What it brought was a hard voice from the side street, where men who had wagered on other endings kept their disappointment loaded, a rifle lifted. A quick, spiteful crack split the square, but the bullet took only a shaving from the post, because Coulter Vance had moved before the sound finished being born. He had Elara gathered to his chest with the lightest force a man can use, and still be sure he turned half a step, and his hand found the pistol, and the report echoed clean, and the shooter stumbled backward into a barrel that spilled dry beans and pride together. And then the square found its feet, and a scatter of lawless motion bloomed, cursing and dust and fear all mixed. Elara's knees loosened, and Coulter carried her without drama, straight off the gallows down 3 steps that knocked a dull rhythm under his boots. The bay horse wheeled with a breathy snort. The crowd broke the way grass parts under quick wind, and the marshal shouted for a hold, not out of hatred, but out of a man's fear of losing grip on his own world. Then the bay dug in, and the street unrolled, and they were past the livery and the smithy and the old mission stones, and the sun stayed bright on their shoulders, as if blessing something no one could yet name. The chase lifted behind them like storm-sound men from the town, and a few who loved money more than mornings throwing themselves into saddles that did not quite fit each one with a reason he would later swear had been noble. The bay stretched, and the land let them pass. Arroyo after arroyo, its dry mouths open in rows. Coulter felt Ilara's breath light against his vest, a fast feather tremble of someone held upright by will more than strength. He chose a wash where mesquite grew close, and dropped into it. Let the hooves bite soft soil, then broke from it at an angle that lost a man who only watched dust. He walked the bay backward a few steps to lie about direction. He dragged a spare pair of boots tied by rawhide across a false line toward the West Fork and scattered chipstone from his saddlebags onto hardpan to chew up any sign. Only a tracker worth his own hunger would read. Then he cut south along a skin of shadow. The ridge through and found a place where the rock made a throat, and they passed into it. The air cooler. The light still strong, but caught and held so that every edge looked carved a little finer. And he slid from the saddle with Ilara in his arms and set her on a patch of clean earth, and gave water in small, careful touches, the way a man feeds a fire that must not flare. She woke like someone surfacing from too long under her eyes, leveling on him, before memory caught up and put its weight on them both. She said nothing. At first, words are dear when a day takes as much as this one had taken, and he said, "You are safe for now." And his voice had the rasp of gravel under wagon wheels, and he watched the mouth of the pass while the bay worked at a sprig of grass between stones. Far off, a rise of dust thickened and then split, as if two minds had argued inside it. And he knew the town would not give up a story like this without sending men to try to fix its ending. He drew the Winchester and checked the chamber by touch not sight, because the practiced do not need to look. He told Ilara to lie still in the notch of shade where light still laid itself clean across her dress, so that nothing was hidden and fear could see itself and grow smaller. He made the bay's tack look careless, loosened the cinch a notch and hung the bridle mouth open as if abandoned. Then he set the rifle on a flat rock and measured a breath, and then another, until the rhythm matched the land again. The first 3 riders showed at a trot full of their own importance, 2 from town by hat shape and posture, and a third with a black coat in a season too hot for it, a sign a man loved menace more than comfort. They paused at the lip of the pass, and one called out something about law that sounded thin in such a place. Coulter kept quiet. Quiet is a tool men forget to carry. He let the nearest pick his way forward, counting the hoof falls the way a cook counts spoonfuls. Then the rifle spoke one short syllable, and the forward rider folded like paper. The others flinched for rock that would not hold them, and one turned grim and mean, and took the same path and got the same answer, and the third broke for open ground, and a wild run toward town, because certain news rides faster than any horse, and Coulter let him take it, because sometimes fear in the right man is the only letter that reaches the desk. It must reach. Ilara watched with a stillness that was not shock anymore, but a choice to see clearly. And when he lowered the rifle, she drew the blanket he set near and kept her voice only for what mattered. "Why do this?" she asked the air. First, then him. The word why shaped different in her mouth than in most. It carried no plea, only weight. He answered, "Because there is a ledger that is not on paper, and I would prefer my name not scratch the wrong page." She looked down at the rawhide on her finger, and then back to the pass. She said, "People say you never miss." And he said, "People need to say something, and often that will do." Then the wind ran its hand through the mesquite and set shadows to moving like small animals at play, and the light kept itself kind even in this hollow. And she asked, "What made you speak wife in front of men who will not forgive the preacher for reading it?" And he said, "Because the word made a door where there had been a wall, and the wall had a rope on it. I have a dislike for ropes and walls, both." And his face did not change as he said it, but the air around him warmed a degree, like a stove set from low to simmer. They moved again when the second dust plume grew wider, black coats in it. Now riders who made a trade of other people's endings for hire their leader Mendez by the set of the shoulders, a hand with no humor who collected coin like a winter collects hunger. Coulter led Ilara through a narrow slide of rock into a shadowed cleft where daylight still held, and the eye could read every edge, and he set her there and took position along a ledge high enough for angle, low enough to slip. If needed, the first pair from the new group worked the pass with patience, and the pass took offense at their confidence. One misstep, and a horse struck loose pebbles, the sound bigger than it needed to be, and Coulter put a round into the dust right at the animal's toe so that both horse and man remembered humility in the sign language of cowards. Spread too thin to be safe. He used the quiet hour that followed to think, and thinking is a frontier. Few men ride well. He counted the ways a town might learn truth and the ways truth might still lose. And in that count, he set himself a new line to walk alongside the vow he had already spoken. When the light tilted toward noon without losing its brightness, he brought the bay close and looped the reins over a stunted juniper, and he cleaned the Winchester in motions that asked the hands to remember who they were. He set the tin cup with water near Ilara, and she drank careful small swallows with her eyes lifted over the rim. He said, "I knew your hands were not on that freight office fire because your hands were at Blake Thorne's sister's table, mending cuffs while the clock in the mission rang 9, and he let the fact sit between them." She searched his face and found no place to hide a lie, so she set lying aside. She said the ledger that burned held names of men who thought no one would ever read them in daylight. He nodded and said, "There are ledgers like that all across this territory, and if the wind were to blow char to every town, there would not be enough rope to match all the crimes." And her mouth held a shadow of a smile that did not last, because understanding seldom wears joy for long. The question that mattered came with a steadier breath, and she asked, "Who hired you to end me?" And he answered with the truth that keeps wolves off a camp. Only sometimes a man from the River Bend freight line who likes his profits quiet and his stories quiet too. His name does not help you live, and my speaking it here helps no one else die slower. And she studied the dust drifting off the ledge and said, "You chose against his coin," and he said, "A man must do that once in his life to learn what the word man means." He added, "I watched 12 days, and in those days you gave away bread twice, stood in front of a blow meant for a girl once and sang out of tune to a boy to keep him brave during a doctor stitch." She closed her eyes a moment, not to weep, but to keep her heart from breaking its own pace, then opened them with a brightness that came not from the sun, but from a decision, and said, "If we live through this, I will not run from the town. I will face what must be faced. You spoke of doors. Then let us walk through the worst one together." And his answer came from a place deeper than show we will. From the mouth of the pass came the hard laugh of Mendez, a sound like iron biting bone. It drew nearer along the floor of stone where boots make a lonely drum. He called out, "Vance, there is no bride worth dying for." And Coulter replied, "You have not met mine yet." And the remark floated down the walls and turned into something lighter than threat, which robbed it of its power. Mendez sent 2 forward to draw fire, and they found that fire quick and honest, and chose to lie down forever rather than learn again the lesson written on the wind. The rest hung back to wait, and hunger grows slow in men who wait. So Coulter set himself to a different task. He took the tin mirror from his saddle roll and flashed a small shard of sunlight up the pass, where he knew the marshal might be by now, if decency had a horse. And after a while a faint distant flash answered twice the agreed signal of a man not blind to what had happened, and he felt a weight in his chest move a notch toward a place where breath comes easier. Blake Thorne was coming, not with a rope this time, but with questions, and questions can save as surely as guns, though they often take longer and cost more courage. The hour pushed on and the land held its white day. The fire they would build later lived only as a plan, and the air stayed clean of smoke, and heavy with the dry resin scent of juniper. Ilara asked in a voice as level as the ledge, "How far until we reach a place where a woman may stand without a crowd taking her measure?" He said, "There is a cabin in the high cottonwoods tucked against a springstone wall." I carry stores there, flour and coffee and a new iron kettle because a man can be spared if he remembers to prepare. And she said, we will make it, and it was not a question. And he said, we will make it, if we move when the land tells us to. The land tells us now. And he lifted her to the bay and mounted behind to keep her steady, and they moved along a ribbon of rock shelf where the drop on one side would school pride into any rider, and the sunlight flashed along the Winchester in his boot scabbard and kept the promise of brightness the whole way, because no darkness owned this day. And when they reached the shoulder of the ridge, they saw the cottonwoods down in the hidden crease of earth leaves trembling like 1,000 small flags of truce, and the sound of water stitched the air thin and hopeful. And for a moment the world seemed capable of forgiving itself, though neither of them trusted it to do so for long. The cottonwoods lifted a cool green shiver against a sky so bright it made the creek stones shine, and morning laid clean light across the spring wall, and the cabin tucked there like a thought a man keeps to himself. Alara woke before the heat came on strong, and for a breath she listened to small, ordinary sounds, the tick of cooling iron, the soft crop of the bay at grass, the faint hiss where water slipped through moss. Then she rose and found beside her old cracked boots, a new pair, plain, but good soft leather shaped for her foot, the stitchwork tight, the soles fresh, and set upon them a scrap torn from brown wrapping, and written with a carpenter's neat care. If you run, at least run easy. She held the note long enough for fingers to learn its edges, then looked to the doorway where Coulter lay on a roll near the threshold, hat tipped over his eyes, not sleeping so much as letting the weight inside him spread out until it quieted, and she set the paper down, not as a refusal, not as a promise, simply as something finished. She stepped outside into light that had no anger in it, and said, I am not going anywhere. And from under the brim, his mouth made the smallest shift that counts for a smile in men who live by few words. And he answered, did not expect you would. And the decision sat between them without noise, like a table newly built that holds days grew a rhythm the kind hearts learn when they mean to mend. He took the canyon trails with knife and snare at dusk, moving like a man who has taught the land to speak back to him in sign and scent. She kept the spring place in order, scraped the stove. Smooth folded linens mended what travel and law had torn. Then, one evening, while air still held sun, and the cottonwoods tossed little coins of light across the yard, she shook his canvas coat to fold it proper, and a small thing fell from its inner pocket. Not a letter, not ink on paper, but a brass token the size of $1 stamped shallow with freight line marks, and upon its face 3 letters and 2 numbers, nothing more, yet enough. U-500. She did not need a preacher to tell her what the letters meant. Brass keeps its truth longer than paper. She stood with it in her palm while the creek went on in its work, and when his boots came across the threshold she did not hide it. He saw the shine and did not flinch. He took it and turned it once and set it on the table and said, coins go where men push them. I carried that one farther than I should. And she said, you were paid to end me. He said yes, and said it plain. She asked, how many names have ridden inside your shadow? And he answered 21, and you would have been 22. And truth filled the cabin like weather. You cannot move. And she did not fall or raise her voice. She only breathed until breath belonged to her again. He drew his revolver from the holster and laid it on the table beside the token grip toward her, and said, if you want this to end in a different direction, I will not step aside. And she placed her hand not on iron but on brass, and slid the token back across the boards and said, if I kill you, I kill the one witness in this territory, willing to stand between me and a rope, and I am done with ropes, so I will choose work instead of fire. And the brass rang once lightly when it touched the wood, and the matter ended there without drama, because some knots undo clean when a woman says they will the heart of summer press down, and they traveled in daylight because hiding invites its own kind of darkness that makes old men's eyes useless and draws bad choices. The way honey draws yellow jackets, he taught her the carbine at the creek bank where willows threw shade over a flat of sand. He had her plant feet where ground told the bones. The real shape of it, he guided breath with his hand, laid light against her shoulder and said, "Stillness is not the same as stopping. Let the world settle, then take your share from it." She missed tin cups twice, knocked a chunk of shale to dust. The third time, laughed once by accident on the fourth shot, and the sound startled her more than the recoil. He never called it good or bad. He called it true or not true, and truth came more often as the days learned her name. They moved camp to a box of rock above a ford, where hooves must slow and sign will tell a careful reader all the things men forget about themselves, and there, the first hard test stepped out of heat without warning. A rifle cracked from the lee slope. Coulter rocked in the saddle, not thrown, only turned by the hit, the bay planting hard to keep him from ground. He took cover behind cottonwood root, and when the second man showed a hat line over stone, Ilara was already flat along the creek shelf, carbine to shoulder breadth set. The way he'd taught her the sight, rose the weight steadied, and she sent the round where it needed to be. The hat line vanished into leaves. The world went silent, the kind of silence that holds judgment. She did not weep. She did not cheer. She counted to 5 in her head, the way he had made her practice, then slid the bolt and waited for the mistake men make when they imagine a woman will freeze. The second mistake came, and she resolved it clean. After the dust settled, Coulter said, "You do not shoot to scare," and she answered, "I shoot to stop," and he nodded, not as teacher, but as someone grateful to be here to nod. At all the riders who did not learn at the ford, learned poorly at a choke in the ridge where the old timber cutters had once dragged logs by cable and left a sling of trunks chained to a shelf above the trail. Coulter and Ilara set a line of rawhide from the chain to a juniper root and dusted it so the shine would not betray them. They drew a decoy track over the shelf to a false pocket where anybody hard with thirst would think shade meant safety. Then they waited with light behind their shoulders, so eyes below would squint and miss the quiet rope running up to the chain. The first pair from Mendez' lot pushed in, ready to collect the last of a story they thought half told. They had the look of men who loved pay more than breath. Ilara held the rawhide in her hand and felt the small fibers give like a living thing when it knows its job, and at the count they had agreed on, she pulled the cord and the chain went off the pin with a cough of old iron. The logs rolled not wild, not cruel, just precisely enough to teach men about gravity. The pair dove backward without grace, lost horses and nerve. Both the rest hung back to shoot at shadows, because bullets are braver than cowards, and Coulter put 2 clean answers into the rocks near their feet, not to kill, only to turn their thoughts toward home, where their courage would not be needed. So loudly the ridge kept its brightness the whole time, because the sun sees no reason to dim itself for foolishness. By late day, the marshal's sign came from the far hills, a mirror's blink twice, then once the old signal from columns drilled under desert suns. When Blake Thorne had worn a blue coat and learned to keep men alive with small orders and good water, he rode in at a pace that respected what the land would allow, and behind him 3 deputies that moved like men who had been told to look first and speak later. He took in the scattered gear, the fresh earth, the 2 bodies wrapped in canvas already cooling under a polite layer of dust. He looked at Ilara, not past her, not through her. He looked like a man measuring his own worth, and he said, "There is a wagon rolled into Mesa Crossing last night with ledgers under flour, and a clerk on it who found his courage late but not too late. He says names that belong to men above my wage, and he says the fire in the freight office was ordered to keep those names from daylight. I am not fond of being used as a broom, so here I am." Then he faced Coulter and added, "I never liked you much, but I dislike being lied to." Moore and Coulter said, "We are agreed on the shape of things. What shape will you give the end of them?" The marshal answered, "Bring me a voice higher than Mendez. I will bring you a gallows for the right neck." And Ilara said, "I will bring it. We have a brass token and a memory sharper than brass," and Blake Thorne bowed his head once in respect for a woman who had earned every inch of her breath since morning. They did not ride for town at night. They bedded where cottonwoods could make small music, and a creek could speak a little, and bright day found them already moving because the plan they carried wanted hard light. Not Shadow Ilara walked into Mesa Crossing at noon, with her hair bound plain, wearing a clean apron over the same wheat dress. She had stood in on the gallows and the square saw her and did not know what to do with its own face. The judge stayed inside his office first, but came out when no one else moved, and the preacher put himself at the bottom of the steps, because some men are made to stand in certain places when weather changes, and the marshal called the freight man by his full name so all could hear Simeon Hart, and the name came crawling red from the shade of the mercantile and the clerk on the wagon. A boy really with more courage than bones pointed at him and said, "That is the mouth that gave me my orders, sir," and then put coins in my hand that did not carry the smell of honest sweat. And Alara set the brass token on a crate where Son could read it and said, "I know its letters and the weight of it, not from guessing but from being the thing it paid for." And the town listened the way thirsty land listens for rain, and Hart tried paper first, then swagger, and at last begged for a door he could run through. But Blake Thorne shut each door with a word until the man stood alone and naked of story, and the marshal said, "The law belongs to me this day, not to any purse," and he turned his hat brim just so to keep the sun from his eyes, and in that shade he did not sign away another soul. Mendez came late, because men who sell endings often do. When there is a chance the show will be over before they arrive. He walked his black up to the edge of the square, and saw a rope coiled at the post, and smiled as if at a private joke. He said, "Vance, you draw towns around you the way a storm draws lightning." Coulter said, "Storms have uses. At least they clear the air." The bounty man measured crowds for fear and found not enough for his liking. He chose a gun instead of a thought, and that ended his usefulness. The marshal put him down with the speed of a man who has run out of patience, and the square remembered how quiet feels. Ilara stood very straight and did not look away from the place where a noise had been. The preacher closed his book, not out of shock, but in order to keep his hands from shaking. The judge looked smaller than the page he loved, and a woman near the well began to cry softly. Not for grief, for relief, which is a far more dangerous flood, because it leaves towns lighter and makes them think they are better than they were 10 breaths ago. The days that followed did not pretend to be a legend. They were work sunup to sundown. They set a kettle on the spring wall and built a porch from boards. The miller was glad to sell cheap now that the freight man had traded his fine hat for shackles. Ilara kept a table under the cottonwoods and fed travelers with stew when meat could be had, and beans when it could not. And the bay learned to breathe easy again, while Coulter traded his bad fame for the plain habit of fixing things that broke hinges, pots, fence rails. A man who keeps his hands honest finds fewer nights staring at rafters. They named the place Wren Spring because names matter, and the map a world keeps of you begins with what you choose to call your shelter. Word went out quiet that coffee there tasted like a second chance, and that a woman with a braid and steady eyes would thread a needle through any rent you brought, and that a tall man with a careful way of standing might or might not be the one you remember from old stories, and if he was, he would not say late summer. A rider came from the border trail boots, white with dust, coat hung with miles. He took the porch step, slow looked into the bright of the yard like a man stepping from one life into another, and asked for Coulter. Vance, his voice a dry rope pulled over rock. The porch held still, even the flies kept wider circles. Ilara wiped her hands on her apron the way a woman does when making a decision and said, "The man, you mean, put his past on a shelf higher than he can reach without a ladder, and we keep no ladders for that kind of climbing here. Will you take water and bread instead?" And the rider studied her, found something he could not push through, and drank and left without asking. A second time Coulter came from the shade where he had been mending a stirrup. His shoulders eased the smallest degree, a thing only someone who loved him would see. And she did, and said, "Not everyone needs a story to leave with. Sometimes water will do." He answered with that quiet that had saved them both more than once. When the first frost showed on the grass tips, and the light came later but stayed bright and clean, they took the brass token down to the creek and set it on a rock and watched sun wash it until the stamp wore thin. Not because metal truly forgets, but because they decided together to take its meaning away. And when they walked back, the world felt less heavy by a handful, and that is all any day can offer a man or a woman who wants to keep going. The marshal rode by before winter, and left a paper that said in language dry as seed corn that no claim lay on Elara Wren, no charge pending, no debt due. And in a smaller hand, Blake Thorne had written, "Keep the coffee hot and your doors open." Justice sometimes needs a place to sit where it is not asked to explain itself, and Elara tacked the paper inside the cupboard, not to display to others but to ease her own breath when wind rattled the roof and memories tried the latch. The year turned, and noon laid a gold square across the table every day. Right about when they needed a promise that work would be worth it. And often, travelers sat in that square and told simple news calves born storms skirted corn coming late. And in those moments, it was hard to believe there had ever been gallows or brass coins, or a town's whisper like a snake through dry grass. But memory kept them honest, and kindness kept them from turning toward hardness again. And when Elara looked at Coulter across that table, she did not see a myth. She saw a man who had learned how to be still without being empty. And when Coulter looked back, he saw a woman whose choice had built a house he could finally walk into without reaching for his gun. It is a cruel land, and it teaches lessons with tools that leave marks. Yet there is a brightness at the beginning of each day that does not ask what you deserve. It only asks what you will make with it. A vow spoken plain under the sun can build a roof stronger than any timber. A hand offered when a rope is near can change how a town remembers itself, and a pass set carefully on a high shelf will gather dust until it loses interest in you. Love on such ground is not a song, it is a set of tasks done faithfully until the heart recognizes its own home. Subscribe to the Wild Frontier Tales and hit the bell under this video, so you never miss another story from this land where gunsmoke fades but memories never do. Every story rides straight into your heart.